This is lesson 3 of the lecture International Economics. I will discuss slide 71 to 89 of chapter 1 International Trade. As the previous analysis has shown, it always comes to international trade if the world market price and the autarky price are different. If the world market price and the autarky price are by chance identical, it will not come to international trade. It's worthwhile to demonstrate this with the help of a diagram. This is again the market diagram we have used so far. Let's assume that the world market price by chance for some random reasons just equals the autarky price. The autarky price is the price level where domestic supply and domestic demand are equal. Now let's assume that the world market price lies just on the same level, like this. Now, in this case, domestic supply is just as large as domestic demand, as before, and is just satisfied, domestic demand is just satisfied by domestic supply. So there is no excess demand or excess supply, and therefore no exports or imports. We have simply no international trade. We only have international trade if the world market price would be higher than the autarky price, then we would have net exports to foreign countries, or we would have international trade if the world market price is lower as the autarky price. In this case we would have net imports. Okay, so identity of world market price and autarky price means we have no trade. The analysis shows the difference between autarky and world market price is in fact the reason for international trade. In the following we will see that autarky and world market prices can diverge for different reasons. First reason is production technologies are different in different countries, which causes differences in productivity. This is the assumption Ricardo has made when he explained how it can come to mutual beneficial trade between England and Portugal. We have used this assumption in the case of Fred and Barney at the beginning of this chapter. So we have already worked with this assumption. But there is also another explanation why domestic prices and world market prices for goods might be different, and this is a quite simple one. Demand for certain goods can be different in different countries. We will explore this reason for price differences in a couple of minutes. The third explanation why domestic prices, autarky prices and world market prices can be different is the endowment with certain production factors is different in different countries. This reason for international trade was first discovered by two Swedish economists, Eli Heckscher and Bertil Ohlin. We will now discuss all three reasons for international trade in some more detail. So let's start with the first one, differences in production technologies. Today, technological differences between countries play a less important role as in the times when David Ricardo developed his theory and published his book on the principles of political economy and taxation in the year 1870. The reason is that today technological knowledge has become mobile and is therefore a tradable good itself. So the level of technological knowledge has become quite similar in different countries. Today, mostly climatic differences can cause significant productivity differences, mainly in the production of food. If you compare, for example, the production of pineapples in Germany with the production of pineapples in Brazil. Nevertheless, the case of differences in technologies is useful as a theoretical starting point, as the following diagrams show. Here we discuss now international trade between two countries, country A and country B. This is the market diagram for a certain type of good. Let's call this good X. And this is the market diagram for the same good in country B, good X. So we start with the assumption that country B and country A have different production technologies. Let's assume country A is more productive in the production of good X as country B. Therefore, the supply curve of country A lies more to the right as the supply curve of country B. So if you compare these orange curves, I think it's quite clear that this curve here of country A lies more to the right as this curve here of country B. So this implies that the production of good X in country A is cheaper. The marginal costs are on a lower level. The demand curve of both countries are assumed to be identical, because we want to analyze only the case where productivity differences cause international trade. So demand curve for country A and the demand curve for country B are exactly in the same position, as you can control with a straight edge if you want to. As a result, the autarky price of country A is lower than the autarky price of country B. This is the autarky price of country A. This is the autarky price of country B. So the country with the lower marginal costs in production has the lower autarky price. After transition to free trade, a new equilibrium price level evolves where the exports of country A equal the imports of country B. So we assume we have only two countries. There's no other country in the world, so international trade must balance between both countries. If country A exports good X to country B, then the exports of country A in this equilibrium must be identical with the imports of country B. That's the argument that helps us to find the equilibrium price by given international trade. There's only one level where the exports of country A, difference between domestic production and domestic demand, is just identical with the imports of country B, the difference between domestic demand of country B and domestic production of country B. Only this price level here has the property that imports of country B is identical with exports of country A. And that is therefore our unique equilibrium price level in the case of international trade between both countries. Okay, so this implies that the price in country A grows above the autarky price in country A after the transition to free trade, while in country B the price falls below the autarky price after a transition to free trade. The result is, as we have already seen, country A, where productivity is higher, marginal costs are therefore lower, this country exports the good X to country B, and country B, where productivity in the production of good X is lower, such that marginal costs are higher, imports this good from country A. So differences in the position of supply curves are here the reason for price differences in the state of autarky, and they trigger the corresponding trade flows between both countries after transition to free trade. The second reason for differences in autarky prices was differences in demand preferences between two countries. Differences between autarky price and foreign price can also emerge if only demand preferences between two countries differ, even if both countries are identical with regard to all other aspects. In this case, differences in the strength of demand can cause differences in autarky prices. For example, if consumption preferences for, let's say, chocolate are higher in country B than in country A, country B will have higher autarky prices for chocolate than country A. After transition to free trade, country A will therefore export as much chocolate to country B such that prices in both countries will equalize, as the following graph shows. So we have again the same setup as before, country A, country B. This is now the market for chocolate, and country A and country B have only differences in the strength of demand for chocolate. Country B has, as we have already assumed, higher demand for chocolate than country A. Therefore, the demand curve of country B, this one here, the orange demand curve of country B, lies more to the right than the demand curve of country A, this one. I think that is obvious. So the strength for demand, the willingness to pay for chocolate is stronger in country B as in country A. The supply curves of both countries are perfectly identical. Supply curve of country A has exactly the same position as the supply curve of country B. As a result, the autarky price in country A is lower than the autarky price in country B, where demand for chocolate is higher. Now, after transition to free trade, a new equilibrium price level evolves once again, where exports of country A equal the imports of country B. So if you take your straight edge and look for a price level where the resulting exports of country A just equal the resulting imports of country B, you find that it has to be this price level. there's only one unique price level where we have this equilibrium of exports and imports. As a result, after transition to free trade, the price in country B falls below its autarky price, while the price in country A grows above its autarky price. In the end, both countries face the same price, and the chocolate exports of country A equal the chocolate imports of country B, where demand for chocolate is stronger. So the country with the stronger demand imports, by the end of this adjustment process, the chocolate from other countries where demand for chocolate is lower. Okay, finally, the third reason for differences in autarky prices. A different endowment with production factors. The Swedish economists Eli Heckscher and Bertil Ohlin point out that a different endowment with production factors can also be a cause for diverging autarky prices and thus for mutually beneficial trade. They demonstrated in a mathematical model that a country A, which has relatively more skilled workers and relatively few unskilled workers, the autarky prices of goods where skilled workers are needed, for example high-tech goods, are lower than in country B, which has relatively more unskilled workers and relatively few skilled workers. Therefore, when a transition to free trade takes place, high-tech goods are exported from country A, where the supply of skilled workers is higher, to country B, where the supply of skilled workers is lower, while country B exports to country A low-tech goods, because country B has a higher supply of low-skilled workers. Let's see how we can describe this with the help of our two diagrams. Country A and country B differ only in the endowment with production factors. Let us assume that country A has more production factors necessary for the production of good X than country B. These production factors are therefore cheaper in country A. As a result, its supply curve, which equals the marginal cost curve, is further to the right than the supply curve of country B, where these production factors are more expensive. As a result, the graphical exposition of the Heckscher-Ohlin case is in fact identical with the graphical exposition of the Ricardo case. The consequences of different supply of production factors affects the position of the supply curves in the same way as differences in production technologies. So graphically we have here the same case as the first one. The demand curve of both countries are again identical, and as a result, in autarky, the price in country A is lower than the autarky price in country B. After transition to free trade, a new equilibrium price level evolves, where exports of country A have to equal the imports of country B. Hence, when a transition to free trade takes place, the price in country A increases due to the additional demand from country B. In country B, the price falls due to the additional supply from country A. In the end, both countries face the same price and the exports of country A equal the imports of country B. Today, this explanation of international trade is called the Heckscher-Ohlin theorem. In verbal terms, the Heckscher-Ohlin theorem states that a country exports the goods whose production need more those production factors whose supply is relatively larger in this country. That is the Heckscher-Ohlin theorem. Now, from an empirical point of view, Heckscher-Ohlin trade is the dominant trade between countries which have different states of development. For example, if you analyze the trade between a developing country like Zimbabwe and a developed country like the USA, we find that Zimbabwe exports primarily agricultural products like tobacco, sugar, natural resources like steel and iron, and low-tech goods like shoes and apparel to the United States, as this diagram shows. These are all products for whose production Zimbabwe has relatively more production factors than the USA: natural resources and cheap, low-skilled worker. On the other hand, the USA exports to Zimbabwe primarily goods like chemicals, transport equipment or telecommunication devices, for whose production the USA have relatively more production factors than Zimbabwe: technological knowledge, capital goods, and skilled workers. Another important theorem which can be derived from the assumptions of the Heckscher-Ohlin model is called the Stolper-Samuelson theorem, because it had been derived from the Heckscher-Ohlin model by the economists Stolper and Samuelson. According to the Stolper-Samuelson theorem, in transition to free trade, the remuneration of those production factors grows whose supply is relatively large, while the remuneration of those production factors falls whose supply is relatively scarce. How can we explain this Stolper-Samuelson theorem, or how can we derive it from the Heckscher-Ohlin theorem? Let me first give a verbal explanation, and then I would like to make a more explicit example. According to the Heckscher-Ohlin theorem, the exports of those goods grow in transition to free trade whose production need more production factors whose supply is relatively large. Consequently, the demand for these production factors grows in transition to free trade, such that their remuneration grows. For production factors whose supply is relatively scarce, the opposite happens. Okay, let's make an example for two countries. Let's call one country the high-tech country, a typical developed country, and the other country the low-tech country, a typical developing country. Let's now assume that we introduce the possibility for free trade. So, according to the Heckscher-Ohlin theorem, the high-tech country will start to export those goods where it has relatively higher supply of production factors. And this is high-tech production. So it will export more high-tech goods. High-tech production will therefore grow. On the other hand, the high-tech country will import low-tech goods from the low-tech country, and therefore low-tech production will fall. Now, if you take a look how this affects labor demand, then of course if you produce more high-tech goods, we need more high-tech workers, for example. So demand for high-tech workers grows. Since we produce less low-tech goods, we need less low-tech workers, so demand for low-tech workers falls. And how does this affect the wages of high-tech and low-tech workers? Of course, since the demand for high-tech workers grows, their wages will grow. And as a result of the lower demand for low-tech workers, their wages will fall. And this is exactly what the Stolper-Samuelson theorem predicts. The wages or the remuneration of those production factors which are relatively more affluent in a country grows, while the wages of those production factors which are relatively more scarce falls. Now in the low-tech country, we will have the opposite result compared to the high-tech country. The low-tech country will import high-tech production from the high-tech country because of the Heckscher-Ohlin theorem, so high-tech production falls. At the same time, the low-tech country will export low-tech goods to the high-tech country, so low-tech production grows. As a result of these shifts of production, labor demand for high-tech workers falls in the low-tech country, while labor demand for low-tech workers grows. So, these changes in demand will then cause lower wages for high-tech workers and higher wages for low-tech workers. And again, this is what the Stolper-Samuelson theorem predicts. Those production factors which are relatively more affluent in a country, low-tech workers in a low-tech country, will have higher wages in case of free trade, while those production factors who are relatively more scarce, like high-tech workers, they will have lower wages because of the introduction of international trade. So now we have derived the Stolper-Samuelson theorem from the Heckscher-Ohlin theorem. We can now use the Stolper-Samuelson theorem to analyze an interesting question. What are the consequences of a transition to free trade on the income distribution in, let's say, developed countries, according to the Stolper-Samuelson theorem? So, how does trade affect the income distribution in a country? In a developed country, skilled workers with a relatively high income typically receive an even higher income because the export of goods grows whose production need more skilled workers. To the other hand, unskilled workers with relatively low income receive an even lower income because the imports of goods whose production needs relatively more unskilled workers grows, such that domestic production of those goods falls. According to the Heckscher-Ohlin model, a transition to free trade causes the income distribution of a developed country to become more unequal. Skilled workers who have already high income receive even more, while unskilled workers who have already a relatively low income receive even less. I think this is a quite interesting result. Now, we can of course apply the Stolper-Samuelson theorem to a developing country. What is the consequence of a transition to free trade for the income distribution in a developing country? Well, on one hand, skilled workers with relatively high income receive a lower income because the import of goods grows whose production need more skilled workers. On the other hand, unskilled workers with relatively low income receive a higher income because the exports of goods whose production needs relatively more unskilled workers grows, such that the domestic production of these goods grows. As a result, according to the Heckscher-Ohlin model, a transition to free trade causes the income distribution of a developing country to become more equal. So just the opposite result as for a developed country. Nevertheless, there are of course also other factors that might affect the income distribution in a country, for example, technological developments or tax policy. Okay, so much for this lecture. In the next lecture we will see that there exists an additional explanation why countries engage in international trade.